Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Elmhurst College. I have the honor of welcoming you to the annual Rudolph G. Shoddy Lecture, sponsored in part by our friends at BMO Harris Bank. The Shoddy Lecture is named for the Reverend Dr. Rudolph G. Shoddy, who came to Elmhurst College in 1946 at the urging of his professor, Reinhold Niebuhr, Elmhurst College Class of 10. Now, when he came, Dr. Shoddy intended to stay only a few months, but he wound up spending 3 decades. And he is widely remembered to be the epitome of what it means to be a teacher here. At Elmhurst, as many people did at the time, the German-born minister offered courses in history, Greek, and philosophy. His style of teaching earned him legendary status among his students, and many of them became his lifelong friends. During our homecoming back in 1984, which was dedicated to Dr. Shoddy, an endowed lecture fund was established by 3 of his former students in his honor, and it was supported by alumni and friends, colleagues, and churches. In the years since then, the college has brought many renowned speakers to this campus to present this lecture in honor of Professor Shoddy. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome the author and public speaker, Taylor Branch, to discuss the shame of college sports. And to introduce this evening's speaker, please welcome me in bringing to the podium, join me in welcoming to the podium, our Director of Intercollegiate Athletics, Mr. Paul Crone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to Elmhurst College and the continuing sequence of the renowned Rudolph G. Shoddy Lecture Series. I'm privileged to introduce to you this evening's noted lecturer, Mr. Taylor Branch. Mr. Branch is an American author and public speaker best known for his landmark narrative history of the Civil Rights era, America in the King Years. The trilogy's first book, Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 1963, won the Pulitzer Prize and numerous other accolades in 1989. 2 successive volumes also gained critical and popular success. Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years, 1963 to 1965, and At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 1968. Decades after, all 3 books remain in high demand. Some reviewers have compared the King-era trilogy, which amassed more than 24 years of research prior to their release, with epic histories such as Shelby Foote's The Civil War and Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. Branch returned to civil rights history in his latest book, The King Years, Historic Moments in Civil Rights Movement in 2013. It presents 18 key episodes across a full span of the era, selected and woven together in language from the trilogy with new introductions for each of the chapters. The result is the compact 190-page immersion for readers in this transformative period of American history. Beginning in the spring semester of 2013, Branch offered the University of Baltimore an online seminar built around the King Years and other texts. Beyond the historical perspectives that Branch has provided readers on the King Years, he also contributed a noteworthy piece in the October 2011 issue of the Atlantic magazine, entitled The Shame of College Sports, the subject of tonight's lecture. Frank Deford, former Shoddy Series lecturer and celebrated sports columnist, described Branch's article as one of the most important pieces ever written about college sports. In an interview with the managing editor of the magazine, Branch described his rationale for writing the article, stating that, as an idealist and reformer, the focus of what needs to be addressed is that colleges should be about colleges, and scholastic achievement, not about the money and scandals. Emerging also from that interview was a photo suggesting yet another of Taylor's accomplishments. The photo depicted his prowess as a linebacker on his high school football team, making a game-saving tackle on an opponent. Taylor knows football. Without further commentary, please let me introduce tonight's guest speaker, Mr. Taylor Branch.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President and Mr. Athletic Director, Paul. It's nice to be back at Elmhurst. I was here in the chapel to talk about Martin Luther King. That is my life's work. It was 24 years, which is a lot longer than 24 hours, and it wasn't supposed to be, but this adventure into sports was a lark. I went to the editors of The Atlantic and said, I've just finished another book that took me 5 years, and before I disappear again, I want to prove that I'm not naturally a hermit. I like to engage with the world. I want to find something I can do in a couple of months. And they said, well, what do you have in mind? I gave them a whole bunch of political topics, and at the end I said, plus, as somebody who almost played college football for Bobby Dodd at Georgia Tech, I've always been curious about why the NCAA is perpetually embroiled in scandal and never seems to get anywhere. And they said, well, that's what you should write about, because it would be a surprise to the Atlantic readers. We don't normally have articles about sports. And it would be a surprise to your readers in race relations and American history. And I said, yes, but I don't really know anything about the history of college sports. And they said, all the better. You can investigate it and do a quick once-over and tell people about sports. So I really stepped into a hornet's nest there, because there's been more interest in college sports than all my previous work in some respects, although I don't think that it will last as long. But we're in a very, very intense period of reflection about college sports today that runs the gamut from concussions and health issues to big-time money issues, and intersects with an impending sense that I've gotten from going around to campuses and talking to presidents and provosts of shakiness in higher education, and how the internet and how costs and the economics is higher education a bubble. We can't afford to do anything we need that affects our revenue streams. So this is an auspicious time, and things have changed even in the couple of years that it's been since the shame of college sports came out. There's going to be a documentary based on it that premieres next week on television. I'll tell you about it if you'd like. And one of the scenes has me, it's a short scene. There are all kind of people on there. I have a small role in it, but one of them is addressing the National Association of Athletic Directors from Division I big-time college sports in Dallas, Texas. Why I was there, I don't know, because I basically said to them, they did a great, their whole session was about the linchpin of what would make their sports continue to be successful financially was the linchpin of amateurism. And my whole criticism is amateurism. So one after another got up there and says, this is our final line, this is the basis of everything, this is the basis of our idealism, this is the basis of our history, this is the basis of our success. And I got up, and the film just has a couple of sentences of me saying, it's easy to see all of that, and I know you profess to be devoted to the welfare of these students. But if your profession of welfare doesn't start with addressing the question of what their rights are and what their rights, how their rights can be abridged, unlike anybody else's rights in the whole society, then you, as long as you do that, you will be participating in a fraud. And it's going to come down around your necks. And you have a duty to think about it before it happens, so you won't just have your head in the sand. So these are most of these guys were much bigger than me, and at the end of it, they all came up They were very polite. They asked for my little reform sheet. I printed up a reform sheet saying there are 3 principles. It's very simple to fix all of this and get it started, at least to become an honest conversation. And one athletic director came up, and the documentary guy, that you see this happen, he comes up and he said, I'm the athletic director at the Naval Academy, and everything you said makes sense except for one thing. You cannot let the animals run the zoo. And everybody stopped. All the other athletic directors stopped. And I said, you said it. I didn't say that, and I'm glad I didn't. But if that's your attitude toward these athletes, you should be more careful. That little scene is in here along with a lot of other confessional scenes running the gamut of every kind of sport, ladies sports, women's sports, Title 19, the history of college sports. And it's well to reflect a little bit on sports and education as an unnatural mix. What is sports, after all? Sports is a place where we go where we don't want to have to think about the context. We don't want to have to analyze. We want to be fans. We want to cheer. We want to boo. We want to be suspended from the cares of the everyday world. We want to yell our brains out. We want to be fans. We want to be fanatical. And certainly you see that now from the birth, the flowering of talk radio about sports. It is astonishing to me the proliferation of people who actually get paid to sit 24 hours a day and speculate on the draft choice at left tackle 2 years from now and what kids are coming up out of high school. There's no intelligence exchange there except within the context of sports, and it's a very interesting channel. There's no such thing as a dumb athlete at any level of sports within the context of their sport. Some sports are about geometry, some sports are about teamwork. There are all kinds of things. If you are a good athlete, you are smart in your sport, but you are not educated to think beyond the context of that sport. Quite the contrary, you are educated to post hole and to specialize, which is why we don't have very many multi-sport athletes anymore. You have to post hole in it, and you have to post hole in it to make the sport develop the way you want. Every sport, in my view, is some mixture of art and war. It has to have an element of beauty to it, or it won't hold an audience. Even boxing has beauty. Muhammad Ali was as graceful as any athlete who ever walked. And gymnasts can be like ballerinas, but they're as competitive as boxers. That's what gives us this fascination with sports. It makes sense that it grows. But it also makes sense that we really want to be a fan when we approach the larger issues of governance of sports, of independent thinking about sports, that ought to be at the very foundation of what universities, as historic centers of free thinking and free analysis about how the theoretical world comes together with the practical world. Universities ought to be pioneers of independent thinking about the world of sports, but I guarantee you that that's the last thing they are today. You can't go to Notre Dame, you can't go to any school in this country and address the question of the vast engine of money at the stadium with Touchdown Jesus there that affects the lives of every student there and of Notre Dame fans across the country. And how is it built? How does it work? What is the value of the third string guard on that football team to that university? How does it relate to the other sports in the university that are subsidized on there? How does it work? How do you evaluate the chances that that guard on the football team is preparing himself playing on that football team for something that will be valuable later in life? All of these questions are off the table because the principle of amateurism says that it's got to be about education and it can't be about money. That sports for those players is just an extension of their scholarship. The NCAA fuses education and sports together in the word student athlete, which NCAA officials will repeat 2 or 3 times every sentence because it's their invented word. And it implies a hybrid creature discovered that only they understand, that is somehow part student and part athlete, and denies the obvious, which is that they are 2 different things. They're a student and they're an athlete. They can be a student and an athlete in many different kinds of contexts, but if they're an athlete who's helping to generate $100 million for their university, they're different from a student that's paying the university or getting a scholarship to come to the university and sit and learn, where the university is in a position of paternal, natural authority by knowledge over that student. And over here, the student is the one whose talent is driving the bargain rather than the other way around, the professor's knowledge. I mean, if you doubt that for a second, just think, where do they point the cameras when the game is on? They don't point the cameras at the coach, not for very long. They point the cameras out on the field where the mixture of art and war is taking place that captivates all of us. Now, why am I here at a Division III school that doesn't play professionalized sports? That is in some senses separate from the whole world that I encountered again, having grown up in SEC football in Georgia. Part of my research was going to an Alabama game in Tuscaloosa. I got up at my mother's house at 4 o'clock in the morning to drive over to Tuscaloosa, turned on Alabama radio, and already they were talking about the game. Some guy came on Alabama football talk radio and said that he had not been able to sleep all night because he had been having nightmares about the coin toss and who was going to kick off. And that was only the beginning of the obsession down there that goes through the whole region. By the time I got to the Bear Bryant Museum, it was packed with like Lourdes at 9 o'clock in the morning. And they had the voice of Keith Jackson saying that Bear Bryant wrestled a bear when he was 9 and scored a touchdown on a broken leg and that sort of thing. And people were sitting there with tears coming. It's unbelievable. And they're out there tailgating since Wednesday with no tickets to the game. No, they came all the way. And I went and interviewed them. Why are you here when you don't have tickets to the game? And they looked at me like I was an idiot, that if I didn't understand why they would want to be somewhere in the vicinity watching their TV and spending a whole week there at a game, then I was hopeless. And I was. Because that kind of sports is the beginning of a commercial nature that really has professionalized and transformed sports beyond all rational examination. But I'm happy you have me here because it gives me a chance to look at this at a different lens, because everybody who thinks about college sports runs into some deeply ingrained inhibition to sports. Well, let's just worry about their education. Their kids. If we pay them, it will make them corrupt. It will make the process worse. I can't stand it. There's something pure about the sport, even if it is generating millions of dollars and has become very commercialized. So people don't really want to think very much about why we are the only country in the world that plays big-time sports at institutions of higher learning. Or the amazing paradox that the NCAA had no power beyond a couple of file cabinets, didn't even have an office until the early 1950s, 50 years old into it. All it did was hand out trophies and make up rule books and help train referees. And it collected dues from its member schools. The top dues was $100 a year. What happened in 1951? Television. And the NCAA convinced the entire sports world that television in its infancy was a mortal threat to college athletics because people would stay home and watch the games on their little box for free and not come to the tickets. And Walter Byers, the founding president, said, if you don't let me regulate this dangerous television closely and channel all television broadcasts through the NCAA, it will kill you. It will rise up, and it needs to be regulated as tightly as nuclear weapons. There's tremendous power, but it's destructive, and it's going to kill college sports. And so, unbelievably, the schools all got together and said, okay, we'll let him negotiate a national contract and decide who gets to play on television. He negotiated his first contract, took a cut out of it, built the NCAA headquarters, the very first one that is now 100th the size of what it has grown up into, because the contracts kept getting bigger and bigger. He left he had a golden age where he had a monopoly on football broadcasting and basketball broadcasting. Basketball continues in March Madness, in the national tournament. But football was destroyed in the 1980s when the big-time football schools said, why should we only have 1 or 2 games and have the NCAA tell us when we can and can't play on television? These players are ours. We want to televise them every Saturday, do our own TV contracts, and the NCAA is an illegal monopoly. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won. As everybody who's gone to the Supreme Court and accused the NCAA of being a monopoly has won. The only people who haven't gone are the players. But the coaches went, the schools went, they took all the NCAA's broadcast money from football. To this day, they don't get a nickel out of all the football broadcasts. They go to all the schools and the conferences that are playing musical chairs. But they kept March Madness. They kept March Madness. They still have it. They now earn nearly $800 million a year for running that one tournament. It comes in a check from the networks to the NCAA, which then takes some of it out and gives to the schools that play in the tournament, takes a huge chunk of it out to run its budget, which is gigantic, and there are cranes in Indianapolis still building more buildings. And crucially, it takes a couple of $100 million and disperses it to all the member schools. Yes, even Elmhurst here gets a check from the NCAA. Instead of paying dues to the NCAA pays you. Not a lot, but when they have to do it for 1,000 schools, that's a pretty big chunk of money. Where does that money come from? It comes from the March Madness, all the pools and everything, and it comes from the fact that the athletes who walk out there in the Final Four don't get any share of that money. Instead, it is kind of siphoned off for all these other purposes without their consent. Some of it comes to you. That's the reason that I'm interested in coming to a Division III school to talk about NCAA sports, because in a way you don't have a stake in this. You're not playing professionalized sports. If the NCAA's amateurism rules, which is the linchpin of saying that any athlete who gets a Christmas card from a sports agent or $1 from somebody else or asks for money, the way any of the rest of us would ask to be compensated for our talent, even mediocre talents, let alone supreme talents that these athletes have, that they have no stake in it. You guys aren't playing that kind of sports. If amateurism were to be declared bogus tomorrow, as I believe it is only a convention of the schools. It's not in any law. You couldn't write a state law to say these people, this class of people shall not be compensated for their labor. No state would write that. It would be thrown out of court. But the schools have gotten together to say you can't pay anybody a nickel above what the scholarship is worth, and if we suspect or get any reason to believe that they are getting that, we will blacken their names, we will declare them ineligible, we will ruin their careers, and we will generate publicity that they are unethical and disgrace them. You guys aren't involved in that. If the NCAA didn't have amateurism rules, would you pay your players? The reason you don't pay your players is not because the NCAA forbids it. The reason you don't pay your players is because you don't want to make sports into a business, because you don't have money. Your athletes could be free to say, please pay me. And you could and should be and still would be free to say, no, we're not going to do it. That would be a freedom. But you are participating by membership in the NCAA in an organization that borrows your approach to sports and says falsely that all of our approach to national sports is the same. It's the same at Alabama as it is at Elmhurst. We're all doing amateur sports. You're doing legitimate amateur sports that don't need artificial rules to deprive, to skim off the talent from professionalized sports and say, we're going to keep all of the money and we're doing it for your own good so that you can enjoy the blessings of amateurism, whether you like it or not. You're doing it because out of its own natural light. But you are lending your name and the way you approach sports to the NCAA, because you give them enormous credibility not to be exposed for what they are really doing when they regulate most college sports, which is that they're running a big, giant sports league, and they are concentrating the power and all of the money in the adults. And quite frankly, specifically the adults that are under indictment today at Penn State. Those offices are the ones that hold all the power in the NCAA. Athletes have no vote. The presidents of university, like the one at Penn State under indictment, the athletic directors, the coaches, and some of the administrators have all the power. At Penn State, they were indicted. They're under indictment now. But the NCAA penalty that came down when the report said these are the people who knew these crimes were going on in the locker rooms, the sanctions came down to take away scholarships from high school athletes who hadn't even gotten to Penn State yet. The rules concentrate power in the adults who are not the players. They take all rights of due process, of representation, of right to livelihood. A scholarship athlete at Penn State can have their scholarship yanked if they look at the coach the wrong way. They have no recourse. So they were silent. No, I'm not going to tell you that I know that it was common scuttlebutt what was going on in there, or that specific athletes would have come forward. But I do know I've been around a lot of big-time college athletes, and they are intimidated. They are told what to do from 5 o'clock in the morning until they go to bed. They know that they have no rights of recourse. And I know that stuff was reverberating around those locker rooms. One janitor saw a rape go on in the shower and was so undone, he said he had never seen anything like that since combat in Korea, and they had to bring in the whole office to calm him down. And that's in the report. And I don't know how many locker rooms you guys have been around in, but I've been around in a lot, and athletes know stuff. And it stretches my credulity to believe that things like that can be going on there without a lot of athletes knowing about it, but they are helpless to do anything about it because the system concentrates power so badly. Now that's money, is reinforcing all that. You don't have the money here, but you do have a sense of involvement because you're all part of the NCAA. What do you get out of the NCAA that compensates for or justifies your involvement in a system that may be fraudulent, that may be dishonest, and at the very least precludes any honest courses about how the NCAA structure works, about the value of big-time athletics, and about whether students and athletes can be made into compatible professions. Until you address the fact that they can be at odds, you can't really have an honest conversation about whether they can be reconciled or not. The NCAA still pretends that big-time college sports is part of education. That's part of their mantra. That even the Final Four March Madness is part of the student athlete's education. So there's no conflict between being a player and being a student. But we all know that there is, that when you're making a lot of money and you're generating a lot of money and your rights are abridged, and when you go into a classroom, those are two different functions. It's not that hard to grasp the concept. Plenty of people have dual, triple careers. You can be a doctor, mom, and a lawyer and have a side job, this, that, and the other, and all by different professional standards. But student and athlete in big-time sports are contradictory. Universities ought to be the place where this is analyzed and discussed about whether it's compatible or not, and decisions be made, and they're not. Your analogy in a Division III school that plays sports, and I don't know anything different, but it seems to me that you play sports the way they should be played in schools. You are roughly analogous to the non-revenue athletes in the big-time sports programs in this respect. At Ohio State, all of the revenue is generated by the football and the basketball teams, and it covers all the non-revenue sports. It comes out of that budget and subsidizes them. Why? Because you don't have to pay the labor, so there's tremendous profit. And they eat up all the profit by spending it on the other sports so that they have a balanced sports program, and they can say, we don't make a profit. And of course they don't make a profit because they use it all up for other purposes, and they're building stuff, and the athletic department swallows it all up. Partly because, as athletic directors tell me, the coach comes in and knows the volleyball coach comes in and knows that I've just gotten a gigantic new Big Ten football contract, and they say that we all need to be on the same the Ohio State University standard, and their costs go up too. And the field hockey team will get $1 million sprinkler that comes out of there. The other sports are subsidized. Those costs used to be borne by the state taxpayers and by the people who pay tuition. But when the influx of this gigantic television revenue, it became easy to say, we don't need to take money from the parents. We don't need to take money from the legislature anymore. We can take the budget for volleyball, for swimming, for fencing, for all these other sports out of the football and basketball surplus. And not only that, we can pay salaries to coaches in non-revenue sports that are commensurate to the ones that we pay the revenue sports. So you'll find softball coaches making $250,000, $350,000 in a sport that's producing no revenue. That's because it makes people feel less guilty that they're paying the football coach $2 million. I had several college presidents tell me, off the record, they wouldn't let me print it, that their own salaries were at least twice what they thought they would otherwise be. Not because they got money out of the athletic department, but because their regents were embarrassed otherwise by the discrepancy between the football coach's salary and their salary. So their solution to that is to raise the president's salary. So I feel implicated in the system. And what I'm trying to tell you is that at a Division Sport 3 school, you are related through the NCAA, benefiting in what I regard as an unjust system that's going to come apart, more or less like the volleyball coach at Alabama or the University of Texas. That you are being subsidized in a much less big way than that person, but nevertheless subsidized, and you're lending your good name to it. I had a lot of conversations with women's coaches, with women's players, who said that if the revenue athletes, football and basketball, had their rights, and it was legitimate for them to bargain above their scholarship and create a free market for themselves, like it's legitimate for anybody else with a talent to do this in the world, including, of course, all other students. The football player analogy is almost like if Zuckerberg were to invent Facebook. As an athlete, the NCAA would take Facebook because he's supposed to be an amateur. He's a student. Football players, that revenue that they generate belongs to the school. So you guys, the volleyball coach, the swimming coach, they came to me and said, if the athletes in the revenue sports have their rights, it will set off repercussions and pressures in the athletic department, and pretty soon they're going to come and take our budget because we don't generate any money. And I said, okay, so you are now recognizing that you are dependent on, and they say that's a disaster. And I said, to me, that's the beginning of a conversation. This is a university. You're recognizing a fundamental fact that you are being subsidized by other athletes without their consent. Do you talk to them about it? Do you thank them? No. This is all kind of sub rosa. But naturally, this is something, the repercussions that go through. People say you can't give college athletes the right to demand money because then there won't be any volleyball team. I say you can't participate in a lie and a fraud and deny somebody their rights rather than have a conversation about how you're going to fund volleyball, whether you want to go back to the other system, whether everything needs to be taken down a notch, whether the university should say we don't want to play professionalized sports. It's not, can we screw up our courage to do it? I doubt it, that they can in the big time schools, but in a lot of the other ones they might be able to. Or do we only want to specialize in one or two sports? But at least you could have an honest conversation. Right now, that conversation has been offloaded and denied under shibboleths about amateurism and purity and devotion to athletics, and if we paid them, we'd be less devoted to their education. The sad truth is that because these sports are professionalized, there are plenty of places where the responsibility for the academic performance of those that are generating the money has been offloaded to the NCAA and to an awful lot of other people to keep these guys eligible, and women too, in some of the big basketball programs. So have no doubt, the basic system is organized like a criminal cartel in the sense that if the NCAA did not band together and say we will set the ceiling for what we will pay people who are producing a lot of money at scholarship and not a cent above, it wouldn't happen. They would compete. I have a basic textbook here in microeconomics that goes through all of the basics of economics. This is by Robert Pindick and Daniel Rubenfield. It's a standard microeconomics textbook. The section on cartel has 3 illustrations. OPEC, the oil cartel, the Copper Cartel, I forget the name of it, but it has a very sinister sounding acronym too, and NCAA sports. It's a classic cartel because the schools, without any benefit in law, without any justification in law, band together and say, we will not compete for athletes monetarily. We will set a ceiling for their labor, and we will take all the rest of the money into gigantic profits that from March Madness alone can float the entire NCAA and give subsidies to every school in the United States. That's a classic cartel. It makes profits too good to be true. It makes profits beyond the rationale of competition. Now, how are we going to get out of this? I'm hoping that one way we're going to get out of this is that one day Division III schools are going to say, we don't need this. You're not going to use the legitimacy and the honesty of our sports programs to justify an amateur system that has no basis in logic and that undermines the basic honesty of thought that ought to go on at universities. You can't have honest thought about amateurism at universities because the big-time schools are too deeply invested in it. I'm also, you see now, just in the last couple of weeks, players wearing little things on their jerseys. All Players United. They are so intimidated that what they're arguing for is to have a little bit better medical benefits and a little bit more lunch money. But the very fact that they can say anything, as mild as it is evidence that they are gaining a voice, and that's the one thing they haven't had. That's how the Olympics changed from an amateurism that was even more pervasive and more exploitative than college sports amateurism. The Olympics, for most of the 20th century, considered college sports corrupt because they were giving scholarships. But then they gave Olympic athletes 20% of the votes on all the U.S. Olympic committees by law, and amateurism dissolved overnight in the 1970s and 80s, and nobody seemed to notice. People thought that they would become hopelessly corrupt and nobody would care about the Olympics if Olympians didn't have to be on food stamps and could make money. To give a voice to the athletes will begin to change things instantly if they have a voice at the table, if they have the same rights that everybody else has. There are legal challenges because it's going into the courts. I told you earlier, the NCAA has lost as a cartel, an illegal cartel, and it's been struck down at every challenge along the way, but the only people who haven't challenged them are students, and there's one going through right now, the Ed O'Bannon suit by ex-students, which is one small step away. I was with the lead lawyer in that case last night in Washington. That case is progressing. They're going to be certified as a class. And one of the defendants, the co-defendant with the NCAA, has already settled and admitted that it was robbing the players. So the courts are going through. And then lastly and sadly to me, I think the most likely place that it's going to come apart is because the big-time schools still don't like sharing through the NCAA money with Elmhurst and 1,000 other Elmhursts. And what they want to do is they want to take that March Madness away from the NCAA. And as soon as they have the football championship that is run by the conferences that are also the big basketball powers, and they make another $1 billion on that, it won't be very long before the NCAA's biggest nightmare comes true, which is when these conferences say, we're going to invite schools to the basketball tournament next year, we will get the television contract, and we don't need the NCAA to do it, and we don't need the NCAA rules, we'll have our own rules, and they won't get any March Madness money. That's what they're trying to negotiate out right now behind the scenes. This is all over money. They're going to talk to you about student athlete, a phrase I do not use, because Walter Byers himself admitted in court that he invented the phrase to defend lawsuits starting in 1950 when injured and even dead athletes, the relatives, sued for workman's compensation on the grounds that they were employees of the universities, and Byers and his lawyers invented the term student athlete expressly to defend against those so that the universities would have no liability, claiming that student athlete meant that athletes who were injured were pursuing extracurricular activities as though they were throwing the frisbee out on the lawn, and therefore the university had no liability for them. And it worked. It worked all the time, which is why I don't use student athlete. One of the great stories in the documentary is the story of Kent Waldrop, who had his neck broken playing in Alabama in 1974 for TCU. They cut off his medical benefits in 2 months. They took his scholarship, so he couldn't go to school. He's been paralyzed ever since. He sued the state of Texas and TCU and the NCAA, which mounted the student athlete defense saying that the school, the NCAA, had no liability. The case lasted 26 years until 2000. The courts finally ruled that the liability of the schools, the NCAA, and the state of Texas was zero. He got nothing. And he's emblematic of all these. This is what student athlete does. So there is a reality beneath a lot of our sentimentality about college sports. You are guardians of an honest sentimentality that depends to some degree on clear thinking. And in my view, it is clouded by the fact that you are affiliated with an organization that draws a lot of its legitimacy from the great mass of schools that play sports the way they ought to be played. So I'm hoping that some of you can think about what do we get out of the NCAA that could make us proud, rather than could make us feel like we may be on the wrong side of a moral and educational and intellectual issue. So let me stop there. I do think that this is a civil rights issue for these players. There are racial elements, but I'm not saying it's racial in its origins, because most of these rules were put in place while schools still excluded African American athletes. But it is a sad truth now that reform comes at a time when minority athletes are dominant. They are or not educated in a lot of these places. They're generating a lot of the revenue, and ironically, the revenue that is taken from them subsidizes non-revenue sports that are dominated by non-minority students coming from generally middle-class and upper-class backgrounds. What a weird system that we're not only distorting honest intellectual values, but we're taking money to create gigantically rich coaches and to subsidize athletes from wealthy families. All of this is the kind of thought that is a little vacation. It's what a college ought to do, but unfortunately it takes you out of, are we going to win this Saturday? And is my favorite player doing well? I love that. Be fans too, but take a little time out to examine the structure and the foundation of something that should give us a lot of pleasure, but I think is endangered right now, along with the very structure of higher education. Thank you.
We'll be taking some questions. If you have a question for Taylor Branch, if you would please come out to the side aisles.
Now,
Holding microphone.
questions can be on anything, and I saw a lot of you leaning back. I was trying to present some graphic and dramatic things, and I may have exaggerated a little bit, but not the facts, but the arguments. But ask on anything, because this is a vast subject. You may just be fans. Yes, sir.
Oh,
Are you going to take a microphone to them, or how are you going to do it?
come on out to the sides. Okay. Here?
They're asking people to come to the sides where the
come to
mics
side
are.
aisles.
Okay, thank you for your great talk. It was really thought-provoking. You said something about the documentary, and I would be very, very interested to hear more about that and where we could see it.
I just got this yesterday. We had our first screenings in New York and Washington. It's called Schooled: The Price of College Sports. It's going to premiere the 16th of October at 8 o'clock on the Epix network. And the Epix is new. It's like HBO, but it's new. It's a Lionsgate, Viacom. It's a joint venture, and it's only got, 20 million households or something. But if you're not Epix members, if you go to epixhd.com or just you can get a free membership for 2 weeks, and they'll show you the film, and you can watch it whenever you want. So it's a documentary. It'll be on Netflix eventually and all that sort of thing, but it's premiering and in film festivals, but it's premiering at 8 o'clock on the 16th on this EPIX network. I'd never heard of it either. But they ran pretty good screenings, and the film, these are difficult ideas. Can you imagine making a movie out of these things? It got a very good reaction in both Washington and New York. There are a lot of the head of the National Football League Players Association is prominently, and he's a producer of the film. So, and there are a lot of athletes that you will recognize who are in the film, and a lot of coaches and presidents and other people talking, and the immortal scene of the guy telling me that you can't let the animals run the zoo.
Can you just repeat the name of the film?
It's called Schooled. SC, like I schooled you. The Price of College Sports on the EPIX network. I tweeted about it today for the first time to tell people that it's coming. I learned from my daughter how to tweet, the same one who gave me my Beatles tie, and put out how people, links to go if you want to sign up, if you want to see it. And in the next day or two, I'll put one up on my website, which is just my website. I'll put it up as a posting there. If you're interested, I'll give you places to find it. But if you do Schooled: The Price of College Sports, or just Schooled Epix, if you Google Schooled Epix, I'm pretty sure that links will come up so that you could sign up to see it. But thanks for your interest. Yes, sir.
I was just reading today where big-time schools, largely because politicians are just as greedy as the people you're talking about, have declined giving percentages of state funds to schools, and the big schools are talking about even suing to become autonomous. And if they do that, then will the actions of the coaches and athletic directors not be state action under 1983?
No, I don't think you can get at the coaches that way because their defense is that they are in private enterprise in a private business, even though, of course, these are tax-exempt businesses. All these things are tax-exempt. But I think you're talking about another phenomenon, which is that generally the state aid to education at state universities has been dropping, and the phenomenon that I ran into, even when I was trying to talk about sports, was that college provosts and presidents wanted to say we should have started our endowment drive 20 years earlier because we're going to need an endowment just like a private university, because eventually this is going to go all the way down. And that's part of all the pressures coming in on college sports, which is one reason that the chancellor at Chapel Hill told me that he spent 70% of his time on sports, Holden Thorpe, and he's now mercifully at the University of Washington in St. Louis, where they don't have any major sports program, because Carolina had all these terrible scandals. Yes, sir.
It strikes me that the two big sports are men's football and men's basketball. Those are both sports where there's no minor leagues. Hockey, baseball, most other sports have a minor league or an amateur system that feeds into it. Wouldn't it make sense for these large universities to get rid of athletic programs as part of the university and simply establish a minor league system with affiliations with universities and then be done with it?
Good question. Well, first of all, the pro football and basketball leagues would hate that because then they'd have to spend the money to do this. Right now they've got a free minor league system, so they don't want to do it. The schools are not likely to want to do it because that's their front porch, because of all the psychological gratification they get. If the faculties stepped up, I have some of these, my three reform things are transparency, balance, and equity. And balance has to do with governance. If the faculties at universities stepped up and did not offload under their responsibility for athletes in the classroom as students the way they've done, this happens at big-time schools almost straightforwardly. That's the NCAA's problem. They're supposed to certify eligibility. I don't have any athletes in my class. I don't want them in my class. One of the problems about big-time athletes is that there's a strange mixture of adulation and contempt for them that doesn't make them part of real student bodies. It's a problem to work on. But to your larger question about, more directly about minor leagues, I was saying at dinner tonight, I think that if you gave athletes the same rights as everybody else, which basically means if they ask to be paid beyond a scholarship, that's a legitimate thing, whether the university says yes, no, maybe, or how much. It's still a legitimate thing that they can do, like any of us can ask to be compensated for something we're doing. I think that you may see a natural evolution into a graded conferences, that where it's illegal for everybody to get together and form a cartel where you don't have any other options, it would not be illegal for groups of schools to get together and say we're going to play at this level and we're going to limit pay above scholarships to nothing or to $5,000 or $10,000. We're going to limit the pay to coaches to this, and another conference would do this, and gradually I think that they would evolve in each sport to a hierarchy more or less like baseball, where you'd have low A, double A, triple A, all the way up at different levels. And every school would have a crisis because they would have hundreds and thousands of alumni that think they belong in the next level up. That would be really hard for the schools. And then at the top, you would have the biggest time, the 50 or 60 big time schools would be no holds, Hold'em Texas poker. Sky is the limit, and they'd be virtually, right under the NFL. And that you would have that. Now, and then it would be the responsibility of the universities to say, okay, This is going to change a lot of ramifications, giving the rights to the athletes, but we have a fundamental decision to make. Do we want to host this, or do we want to try to offload it? I've heard some big-time administrators say, well, we'd like to offload it like we offload the hospital. University of Michigan spun off the hospital. Could they spin off the big house? I don't know whether they could or not. They could play semi-pro sports, where they're paying the players, with Michigan athletes, and the faculty should say, I don't care what they're doing, I'm responsible for whether they're doing Michigan-level college work, and we are, and it's on us if we fail, and we don't care if we flunk out the athletes. What I hope would evolve from that, if they keep big-time sports, is that we would evolve to a place where people would respect athletes 10 times as much as they do if they are elite athletes working 60 hours a week at their sport, and they're also successful students. They are pretty astonishing people in this culture, and I've seen a lot of them at different schools. In the soccer players, they're really remarkable people, and our weird fandom about athletes to worship them or to cheer or boo them hinders our full appreciation for what they're doing. But the idea of a minor league system and a layered thing would work. It would be legal, whereas the current system is not. It's not fair, it's not honest, and eventually I think it will be ruled illegal. Yes, sir.
What you've done here is make this an issue of money. And if the so-called student athlete is going to get his share of the money, or their share of the money, then they have to organize. Now, do you foresee the possibility of student athletes, to use that term, organizing as unions and bargaining with their schools for benefits?
Do I foresee that?
Is that possible? Would that be something that's within range of possibility?
It's within the range of possibility. It's not within the range of likelihood, because unions are having a hard time anywhere in the United States, and in an industry as disparate as college sports, it would be very difficult to get a single negotiating body that would deal with anybody. But obviously, if students have the right to represent their own interests, they have the right, which they don't have now. They have no voting interest anywhere from the NCAA on. If they have the right to represent their own interests, they could theoretically collectivize at a school. They could elect a representative to bargain. They could do all kinds of things like that. Whether that would be a formally recognized union or not, I don't know. I do know, and this may be objectionable to you, but to me it's just part of being honest about professionalism, they would instantly have agents. These are very, very complicated arrangements and contracts they're negotiating, and they would have agents, and the agents that are getting demonized and even now indicted are just doing their jobs, and that job is a recognized industry that we all support. So yes, I think they would be entitled to pursue anything. I don't think a nationwide union of college players is very likely.
Then how can they negotiate?
Pardon?
How can they negotiate if they can't organize?
Sir, it's very easy. I'm the best high school tackle in the state of Louisiana. The coach from LSU was just here offering me this. What are you going to offer me? That's not hard. Dads will do, plenty of dads will be negotiating for these kids, and they won't be shy about it. And a good player is going to have a market for them because they're going to generate wins and interest for their team. So it will start in the recruiting, and there will be, in my view, I predict there will be tremendous skirmishes and sideline battles over whether or not these people have turned 18 by the time they do that, because then they're of age, they're legally adult, they can do these contracts. Otherwise their dads are going to be doing it, and quite sadly a lot of the dads get carried away and they think they're negotiating the contract, and you never can tell what's going on. But they will be able to negotiate for themselves. Now, whether they'd be able to do as good as they could if they were union. a union is hard to form in any case, especially when you've got lots and lots of disparate buyers as opposed to the NFL or Major League Baseball. But I think it's really hard when there's such a transitory period. They're not there for very long, and they start out at 18. But I do think that there would be a lot of negotiation for the individual players from the time of recruitment on.
That means that only the stars would be paid big money. The players who are not stars would be paid less money.
Yes, that's the market. But it does not mean you cannot have a good football team. It would more or less mirror the payrolls. Even a second-string offensive guard for the Baltimore Ravens makes about $2 million a year. You're not going to have a good elite college football team if you pay everything to the quarterback. You're going to pay these linemen too. Plus, these are kids. I don't know how if the chemistry would work as well in a college team if there were as great a disparity on the payroll as there is among the pros. But the market will tell you, more or less as it has at the pros, that every one of those positions, including the non-glamorous ones, are valuable. They're not as valuable. And the NCAA will tell you that since 97% of the best college players are never going to play pro, they should just forget it. But I guarantee you that the way the college athletes look at it, and even the way the pro athletes look at it, is that that means that for 97% of you, the only time that you have a chance to get a nest egg out of what you've been doing for your whole life and that you think is your singular talent is when you're in college. So hire an agent, or if you've got a responsible dad, let him negotiate the best deal you can.
That's right. That will destroy amateurism.
So is that what, it's obviously this is in need of reform. I mean, it's what we've been talking about this whole time, but what are the next steps? Is it that players should start getting agents? Like, and Cam Newton is one of the examples of a dad who went to Auburn and was like, I want my kid to go to Auburn so that he can get X and Y.
Well, they can't do it now because the NCAA system is still being enforced. Cam Newton was excoriated across the country. I mean, the cover of Sports Illustrated last month said Oklahoma State, the standard of journalism is that dirt is when players get any of the money that they generate. Therefore, we are all indoctrinated with the NCAA vision of the world. I'm presenting to you a different vision of the world where the system itself is what's dirty. We're not there yet. I mean, if you tried to go out and negotiate now, even saying that you'd like to get some money is a violation. I mean, you'd be saying you wouldn't get anywhere. So any sort of straightforward bargaining would ruin your career before it started. So change has got to make that possible. I'm saying that it is bogus, especially because it has no stature in law. You don't have to repeal any laws to get rid of this because there are no laws to repeal. There are none. And the NCAA went before Congress. It went all the way to the Supreme Court to get itself exempted from due process obligations in its enforcements. But it testified before Congress, its chief counsel, that it didn't have to do that anyway because due process applies under the Constitution only when potential plaintiffs, have substantial rights or freedoms at stake. And playing college sports is not that. It's part of your education and it's an extracurricular. Therefore, you have no standing for a due process, which is a perfectly circular argument. You know, you have no right to due process because you have no rights, substantial rights at stake. So right now, the system is a closed system where even to put, all players united, which doesn't say anything, is controversial. And last night they came, two of the people that played and got publicity, the quarterback at Georgia Tech, just the last couple of weeks, just put this little thing on their shoulder. Are co-plaintiffs in the O'Bannon suit. And the lawyer said they are under immeasurable pressure never to do that again. Just to put that up there, it doesn't, I mean, and get a little publicity that they might want to speak. Not say, I'm going to negotiate a free contract. So we're along, I'm saying the system is creaky, but it is still almost North Korean in its total social control over these players. I mean, Cam Newton, at the same time he was being excoriated for possibly getting some money, he had to wear 15 Under Armour logos on his uniform in every game, precise numbers specified in Under Armour's contract with Auburn University, which paid, I think Under Armour paid Auburn University $10 million a year. And Cam Newton had to wear 15 Under Armour logos, and the NCAA office, in contract compliance, specified exactly how large they were and exactly where they could be. One on each sweatband, one on his visor, one front and back on his headband, one on the ankle, one on each ankle, everywhere. So think of what that means. So they're really a controlled substance right now. So I think everything can and will change, that the system is creaky, but it is still very, very powerful. I'm not, maybe I've misled everybody into thinking that students can run out tomorrow and say they'd like to negotiate a new deal. They can't. Under the current system right now, they'd come down on them pretty hard. Yes, sir.
I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
So you're challenging a really well-established, powerful, rich system, even if it's creaky right now. So I'm wondering, whenever that happens, whenever you're challenging the livelihood of very powerful people, you typically get a lot of blowback. So I'm wondering, what sort of blowback have you got? Have you gotten any personal threats? What's happened to you?
I've gotten a lot of, we respected you when you were writing about Martin Luther King. What went wrong with you? What made you think you know anything about sports? A lot of hostility, but no threats. I'd like to think that I'm worthy of being a threat right now, but I don't think I am. They still think that they're pretty much, at least publicly, in control. Although everybody tells me Mark Emmert is, he's the head of the NCAA, is weaving and bobbing about how to make change. He wants to placate the big-time schools that would like to pay the players. Basically, what they want to do is they want to pay the players like $2,000 or $3,000 and ballyhoo that and say it's a big deal, say it's still amateurism and we have the right to define what's amateurism. We're going to pay you more money. But the smaller schools don't want to do that because they say they can't afford it. And then the big-time schools say, if you don't do this, we're tired of your picayune rules and ruining Ohio State's football program because of the social media. Caught some athletes saying we're getting discounts on tattoos. And they get it on the social media, or Carolina, somebody is tweeting from a party, and the next thing you know, the NCAA goes in and confiscates every laptop from every football player and goes through all their emails with tutors and everything, and it blows up into a huge scandal. The big-time schools, if he doesn't figure out a way to let them relax the rules and give the players some money, because the money is so enormous, they're saying, why should we go through all this grief? If the small schools stick saying we can't afford it and we don't want to do it, that adds to the impetus for the big schools to say, well, let's break away. We don't want. So he's really walking a tightrope, but he's doing pretty well. He's going to collect a big check next March Madness to tide him over. It's right at $800,000, and that's not all the concessions and all the commercial endorsements and the deals they have with every major company and all that. It's just the check from TV. So there's a lot of money there, and they're not going to go down without a big fight.
This will be the last question for the evening.
Thank you.
Oh, it's me. Oh, thank you. Hi. Curious, just the scope of the money involved. But in your conversations with coaches, conference administrators, university presidents, has there been any acknowledgement that this can't hold much longer, so that it would kind of drive some sort of internal change or internal reform. Has that, you know, I'm in a town that Jim Delaney lives in, and he makes an astronomical amount of money for the Big Ten. And he's compensated accordingly. And it just strikes me as that I'm just staggered by these sums of money on this basis of your product is these 18 to 21-year-olds. These are knowledgeable people. They're articulate people. And it just strikes me that they just can't come to an acknowledgement that this can't, it just can't go on. Has there been any kind of acknowledgement in your research?
That's a very good question. I never really thought of it that way, and it breaks down very sharply. Every college president that I talked to from the big-time schools said unequivocally, we're on a trajectory that is not sustainable. We cannot keep doing this. The pressures to get the coaches, the arms race to build the buildings, to get the coaches, and then all the other teams come in and say, we want commensurate raises, and so it goes beyond the windfall. It is unsustainable. Britt Kerwin, who's chancellor at the University of Maryland, used to be he's been all over the place. He said, and he's also chairman of the co-chair of the Knight Commission. He said straight up, for quotes, 96% of our Division I big-time college presidents agreed with the statement that we are on an unsustainable trajectory and we have no idea how to stop it. So the college presidents, I think, know, but they don't really know what to do. The coaches are in denial because they are atop the gravy train. Coaches say that they can figure out some way to do it. And quite frankly, the only ones that showed any doubt about that were quite aware that in their minds, the other coaches in the non-revenue sports ought to take a hit before they take a hit because they're subsidizing them. Yeah. That's what the coaches think, that they're already getting a raw deal because money that should come to them is building a sprinkler for the field hockey team. Or something like that. So coaches are in a different world. And to be honest, sir, I never got a single conference commissioner to talk to me. The conference commissioners are the power here. They're the ones driving all this musical chairs over the TV contracts. They are the great powers. They and the TV network, the TV executives, are the powers in college sports. And sadly, the college presidents feel like figureheads. And the coaches are strong and hanging on as much as they can. But the athletic director, the conference commissioners are really shrewd people. Nearly every one of them has an NCAA background. They know how the NCAA works when they're negotiating with them and jockeying with them over the National Football Playoff. They're already saying that this 4-team playoff is not going to last very long because it's not stable enough to survive an attack from the NCAA, which will say it's not national enough, that they'll have a 6 and probably 8-team national playoff within a couple of years for football, which would generate much more revenue and get them in a solid enough position that they'd be ready to challenge the NCAA. So the conference commissioners, so far as I know, not a single one of them lives anywhere near a campus that they're affiliated with, including Jim Delaney. I think he's in downtown Chicago.
He's not too far from here, but
yeah,
miles from Northwest.
Yeah, right. And he's a Tar Heel too.
Yeah.
He's from Chapel Hill. But yes, so all the presidents know that it's not sustainable. The coaches are in denial or actually in grievance. Coaches literally believe, as well as they're doing, that they're getting, the athletic directors are fleecing money that they want to spend on their 14th strength coach or on themselves to pay for some other sport. So coaches are aggrieved, and conference commissioners are the silent, shrewd power behind the throne, and I couldn't get a single one of them to talk to me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's all, thank you.